Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting source material today.
Yeah, it's a report looking closely at this paper, The Illusion of Thinking. Catches your eye, right? By Shojaee and colleagues.
It really does. And it's all about trying to figure out if these advanced AI models, the ones designed for reasoning, are actually, thinking, or if it's something else entirely.
Exactly. That's the core question. Are they reasoning, or is it a clever mimicry?
So our mission here, especially for you listening who shared this with us, is to really unpack it. We want to pull out the key takeaways, the surprising bits, and, well, what it all means for AI going forward.
We'll guide you through the important findings, the evidence they present, and paint a picture of what this study tells us about AI's current strengths and, crucially, its limitations.
Okay, let's dive in. First up, the paper talks about large reasoning models, LRMs. We hear about LLMs all the time, but what's the distinction here?
Good question. Think of LRMs as specialized versions of LLMs. They're built or fine-tuned specifically for tasks that need multiple logical steps. The main thing is they're designed to output their working these intermediate steps. People call them reasoning traces or thoughts. You know, the whole chain of thought idea, HOT.
Right. Think step by step. So models like OpenAI's O1 or O3, DeepSeek R1, Anthropic's Claude 3.7 Sonnet, thinking those fall into this category.
Precisely. And there's this belief, or maybe hope, that generating these steps makes them genuinely better at complex stuff.
But there's skepticism, too.
Yeah.
Like the paper mentions that.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Are these traces real-time reasoning, or are they just, like, justifications cooked up after the model somehow found the answer? A post hoc explanation.
And figuring that out is tricky because, as the paper points out, our usual ways of testing these models have problems.
Huge problems. The authors really hammer this. Standard benchmarks, often contaminated. The model might just have seen the answers or very similar problems in its training data.
So it's memorizing, not reasoning.
Pretty much. The source mentions the A math tests as a possible example. Performance sometimes dips on newer versions, maybe because the older ones were just memorized better.
And the other big issue. Benchmarks usually only care about the final answer. Was it right or wrong? They don't look at how the model got there, but that how is exactly what we need to understand if we're talking about reasoning.
Which leads us to the methodology Shojaee and the team used. They went for controlled puzzle environments.
Yes, and this is quite clever. Puzzles give you things benchmarks don't. First, fine-grained control over complexity. Add a disk to Tower of Hanoi. Add a checker pair, boom. Harder problem, same rules. You can really see how they scale.
Okay, so you can precisely measure performance against difficulty.
Exactly. Second, it helps dodge data contamination. You can generate brand new puzzle instances they've definitely never seen.
Right, novel problems.
Third, puzzles isolate algorithmic reasoning. You don't need world knowledge, just the rules you're given. It strips away some of the linguistic complexities.
Focuses purely on the logical steps. Right. And maybe, most importantly, puzzles let you check every single step. You can build a simulator for Tower of Hanoi, say, and validate the model's entire thought process, move by move, not just the end result.
That's powerful. So what puzzles did they use specifically?
They used 4 classics with different scaling properties. Tower of Hanoi that gets exponentially harder, checker jumping quadratic scaling, then river crossing and blocks world, which are roughly linear, a good mix to test different kinds of complexity.
Okay, great setup. So they unleash these top LRMs, O3 Mini, DeepSeek R1, Claude 3.7, Sonnet thinking onto these puzzles. What did they find?
Well, this is where the core findings emerge. They identified what they call 3 regimes of complexity. It's about how LRMs, the ones with explicit thinking, compare to standard LLMs without it as problems get harder.
3 regimes. Okay, what's the first one?
The first is low complexity. And this was kind of surprising. On easy puzzles, standard LLMs often did just as well, or sometimes even better than the LRMs.
Better, without the explicit thinking steps.
Yeah, and they were more efficient too, used fewer computational resources, fewer tokens. It seems like generating all those extra thought steps for simple stuff is just a necessary overhead, maybe even detrimental.
Huh. Okay, so what's the second regime?
Medium complexity. This is the sweet spot for LRMs. Here, generating those intermediate steps, the chain of thought actually provides a real advantage. They generally outperform the standard LLMs in this zone. The thinking helps.
Right, so the thinking mechanism pays off when things get a bit tricky. But what about when they get really hard?
That's the third regime, high complexity. And this is where things fall apart. For both types of models, LRMs and standard LLMs, performance just collapses. Accuracy often drops straight to zero.
3-0, wow.
Yeah, LRMs might hang on a tiny bit longer, solve slightly more complex instances than standard LLMs, but they eventually hit the same wall. They all fail catastrophically.
This is that accuracy collapse beyond complexity threshold idea from the paper.
That's exactly it. It's not a gentle decline, it's a cliff. And it happened for all the LRMs they tested. This strongly suggests that they haven't learned the underlying algorithm in a way that truly generalizes or scales. They can't handle problems significantly harder than what they've effectively learned patterns for.
And there was another really weird finding tied to this collapse, right? The reasoning effort decline.
Yes, this one is fascinating and frankly, quite counterintuitive. So, as problems get harder initially, the LRMs generate more thought tokens. They seem to be thinking harder.
Which makes sense. Harder problem, more steps needed.
You'd think so, but right as they approach that complexity level where they're accuracy tanks, they suddenly start generating fewer thought tokens. They reduce the reasoning effort.
Wait, so when it gets too hard, they just try less, even if they have the token budget?
Exactly. Even when they're not hitting maximum output limits, they generate shorter, incomplete, incorrect reasoning traces. It's almost like they recognize they're out of their depth and just give up on generating a long, plausible-looking sequence.
Why would they do that?
Well, one interpretation, tying into other research like Yu et al.'s work on RL, is that the training might inadvertently teach them to favor known patterns. Maybe the RL biases them towards sequences that resemble shorter, successful solutions seen in training. When faced with a truly hard, novel problem that requires a long, complex, maybe low-reward initially sequence, they might just default to outputting a shorter, ultimately wrong trace because it vaguely matches patterns associated with success on simpler problems.
So the effort isn't about logical exploration, but about pattern matching effort.
That's a very plausible interpretation based on this data. It really challenges the idea that they're engaging in flexible, persistent problem solving when things get tough.
Okay, so the overall performance collapses. Let's look inside those thinking traces they generate. What did the step-by-step analysis show?
That analysis confirmed these patterns. On the simple problems, they saw what they called the overthinking phenomenon. The LRM might actually find the correct answer quite early in its trace. But then it just keeps going. It keeps generating more steps, exploring other paths, often incorrect ones.
That's so inefficient. Why would it do that? Does it not know it found the answer?
That's one possibility. Maybe it lacks a strong internal stop signal when a valid solution is found. Or perhaps the training, especially RL, rewarded longer traces on average. Maybe because longer traces often correlated with success on harder problems, and it didn't learn to be concise on easy ones.
So it finds the goal but keeps wandering around. Or it's just trained to be long-winded.
Something like that. Then, at moderate complexity, if they found a correct solution, it usually showed up later in the trace. They'd explore some wrong turns first, suggesting more of a search process.
So maybe some limited self-correction there. Trying things out.
Yeah, you could see it as a limited form of self-correction or exploration at that middle level. But it's clearly not robust. The overthinking on easy problems shows inefficiency, and the total failure at high complexity shows the search just breaks down completely. They couldn't find any correct path in the trace at high complexity.
Right, the trace analysis just confirmed the total failure. It wasn't just a final answer slip-up.
Exactly, they couldn't even construct the path.
Now, the paper mentioned some really specific behaviors that are just baffling. What were those?
Okay, get this one. This really makes you think. They took a puzzle like Tower of Hanoi, where there's a well-known optimal algorithm, and they gave the LRM the explicit step-by-step algorithm.
They told it exactly how to solve it.
Yes, like move disk from A to C, then move disk from A to B. The perfect instructions. You'd assume following instructions is way easier than figuring it out yourself.
Absolutely. That should be a piece of cake compared to discovering the algorithm.
But it wasn't. Giving them the explicit algorithm did not significantly improve their performance on the complex instances, and it didn't stop the accuracy collapse.
That makes no sense if they're reasoning procedurally. What does that imply?
It's strong evidence that they aren't executing the algorithm in the way a computer program would. They don't seem to be able to reliably perform symbolic manipulation or follow sequential logic step by step, even when told exactly what steps to take. It suggests their process is still fundamentally about generating sequences that look like algorithmic execution based on patterns, rather than truly understanding and following the rules.
Wow. Generating text about doing something versus actually doing it. That's a huge difference. Any other puzzling behaviors?
Yeah, they also found Inconsistent reasoning across puzzle types. A model might do surprisingly well on a really complex Tower of Hanoi instance, getting many steps right, but then it might completely bomb a much simpler river crossing puzzle that objectively requires fewer steps and seems logically easier.
So it's not like they have a general logic level that applies everywhere.
Doesn't look like it. The capability seems inconsistent. The authors speculate this might be down to the training data. Maybe complex Tower of Hanoi examples were just more common in the training mix than, say, complex river crossing examples. So performance might be tied to familiarity with specific problem structures, not a general abstract reasoning ability.
Again, pointing back to pattern matching specific structures rather than general rules. Now, the authors were careful to mention their study's limitations, too.
Yes, definitely. They acknowledge they only use these abstract puzzles, not problems needing real-world knowledge. They were using black box APIs, so no peeking inside the model's internal workings. And their puzzle simulators allowed for perfect step validation, which you often don't have in the messy real world.
Sure, those are fair caveats. But even so, the core findings about the collapse, the failure to follow algorithms, the inconsistency, they feel pretty significant.
Oh, absolutely. They provide really compelling empirical data suggesting that what we're currently calling reasoning in these models is fundamentally different from robust, generalizable, human-like reasoning.
And this work doesn't exist in isolation, right? How does it connect to other research on LLM reasoning?
It ties in strongly. Think about chain of thought. This paper adds weight to the skeptical view. Yes, COTI helps in that medium complexity zone, but the fact that models still collapse, still fail to follow algorithms even when generating COTI, suggests COTI isn't necessarily the reasoning process itself. It might be more like a learned output style or a post hoc rationalization.
And what about the role of reinforcement learning, RL? People use that to make models better reasoners.
Right. The hope is RL teaches better strategies, but these findings, plus other work like UXLers, raise doubts. It looks like current RL might be mostly just amplifying existing capabilities, biasing the model to find known solution patterns more reliably, the ones it saw during training.
So it makes them better test takers on familiar problem types, maybe.
Potentially. But it doesn't seem to be teaching them genuinely new reasoning skills or allowing them to solve problems fundamentally harder than what they've learned patterns for. It's more about exploitation of known paths than exploration of truly novel reasoning.
Okay, so better retrieval of known solutions, not necessarily better fundamental reasoning.
That's a fair summary of the concern. And remember, these puzzles are essentially planning problems. So this aligns perfectly with research like Valmikam et al.'s. Large language models still can't plan, which also found significant limitations in planning and reasoning about actions over time.
Right, the planning failures. That seems related.
Definitely. And then there's the theoretical side. The accuracy collapse observed here fits beautifully with what Ziri et al. Proposed in their Faith and Fate paper about transformers and compositionality.
Remind us, what was their argument?
They argued that transformers tackle complex compositional tasks mainly through something called linearized subgraph matching. Basically, really sophisticated pattern matching on sequences. They predicted this approach would be brittle and prone to cascading errors as complexity increases, leading to exactly the kind of sharp performance collapse Shojaee et al. Observed empirically.
So the theory predicted this kind of cliff, and the experiments found it.
Exactly. It provides a potential mechanism for why these models hit a wall.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, this paper, the related work, what's the overall picture of LRM reasoning right now?
The picture that emerges is one of impressive capability, but capability rooted primarily in highly sophisticated pattern matching and retrieval, scaled up massively. It's not negligible. It allows them to do amazing things within the domain of learned patterns. But it seems fundamentally different from deep, generalizable algorithmic understanding or flexible symbolic reasoning. It's powerful, yes, but also brittle when pushed beyond its learned experience, especially with increasing complexity or novelty.
Which has some pretty big implications for the whole AI industry. Where do we start?
Well, first, evaluation needs a serious rethink. We can't just rely on leaderboards based on potentially contaminated benchmarks and only check the final answer. We need methods like these puzzle tests controlled, transparent, testing generalization, compositionality, and verifiable reasoning steps.
We need to test how they solve things, not just if they get the right answer on known problems.
Precisely. Second, for actually building better models. This suggests just making current models bigger or applying more of the same RL techniques probably won't be enough to overcome these core limitations. The collapse seems inherent.
So we need fundamental innovation.
Looks like it. Maybe entirely new architectures, neurosymbolic hybrids are often mentioned, combining neural pattern matching with symbolic logic systems. Maybe totally different training goals that reward general strategy learning over imitating specific solutions. And certainly hybrid approaches where LLMs work with external verifiable tools like symbolic calculators or planners for tasks demanding precision.
This must also temper expectations around artificial general intelligence, AGI.
Absolutely. If you believe robust, scalable, general-purpose reasoning is a prerequisite for AGI, then this research strongly suggests current LRM tech isn't on a direct path there. We need fundamental breakthroughs first. It calls for a more realistic perspective, appreciating LRMs for what they are good at: language, pattern matching, information synthesis, without overstating their current capacity for truly flexible, reliable reasoning.
And that complexity cliff you mentioned earlier, that sounds dangerous for real-world use.
It really does. The fact that performance can just plummet to zero unpredictably beyond some complexity threshold is a major concern for safety and reliability in critical applications. A system might work perfectly 99 times, but fail catastrophically on the 100th instance if it's just slightly harder. That's not graceful failure.
Yeah, that's scary. And finally, the black box problem remains.
It does. Analyzing the reasoning traces helps, as this paper shows, but it's still looking from the outside. We need much deeper interpretability research to understand why they fail when they do, why they hit that cliff. Without that understanding, building genuinely trustworthy systems is incredibly difficult.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive on the illusion of thinking.
I think the core takeaway is that this paper, using a really careful method, provides strong evidence that despite impressive performance and complex thinking outputs, current LRMs show fundamental limits in generalizable reasoning. Their ability doesn't scale robustly with complexity. Often it seems more like a sophisticated illusion built on pattern matching.
And it highlights that getting to truly robust AI reasoning means tackling tough challenges, things like genuine symbolic manipulation, compositional generalization, and ensuring that the steps they claim to take are actually verifiable and causally linked to the outcome.
Right. And the path forward seems to involve looking beyond just scaling current methods. It points towards needing new architectures, new training paradigms, much better evaluation techniques that probe generalization, and a serious push on interpretability.
Understanding these limits isn't about dismissing AI's progress, is it?
Not at all. It's the opposite. It's about mature science. Knowing the boundaries, understanding the failure modes, that's absolutely critical. Pinpointing what current models can't do reliably is precisely what tells us where the research needs to focus to build the next generation, one that might actually overcome these hurdles.
It really gives you a lot to chew on.
For sure.
Like, if performance can just fall off a cliff like that, how comfortable can we really be deploying these systems in high-stakes areas where unexpected complexity might arise?
And maybe even more fundamentally, if giving the model the perfect instructions doesn't reliably help it solve the problem, what does that say about how fundamentally different its information processing is from how we humans learn and apply rules?
These are the kinds of big, challenging questions that surface when you really dig into source material like this.
Questions that are going to be central to AI research for a long time, I suspect.
Well, that wraps up this deep dive. We really hope walking through these findings was valuable for you.